In this Webflow, Wized and Xano bite, we're going to talk about checkboxes and keeping a persistent state so that when a user clicks through them, what's being sent to the back end will show up on the front end, and any changes will also be live. So let's get started. First, we're going to pop into Webflow. Now, with Webflow, the first thing to know is that we are going to use the default checkbox field setting for the checkboxes. And that is because if we use a custom setting, then we will not be able to see the checkbox checked. So in order to use this, you will need to use some custom code CSS if you want to change the style of the checkbox while it is checked. And the other thing that we want to do here is we're going to go into the checkbox button tag. We want to make sure that we set a keyboard focus state on it. So throw an outline, do something so that it is accessible. And then in this checkbox button tag, so what we have as far as the setup of this, there's a checkbox. I have it labeled field tag, label tag, and button tag. You can label them however you want, but it's probably a good idea to do that so that you can change the CSS style. It's really easy. So in the button tag, we need to go to the checkbox button tag settings. And what we want to make sure that we do is we want to make sure that we're putting in a Wized attribute. So pop in the name Wized, and then we put a value. In this case, I'm using Enum option 3 checkbox, Enum option 2 checkbox, and Enum option 1 checkbox. And as far as Webflow, that's it. That's all we need to do. We need to set those Wized values, and we can also set our IDs and our name at the same time, but we're actually not using the name or the ID in this particular operation. So without further ado, we're actually going to hop into the backend, and we are going to go check out Xano. Now, while I'm going through this, I assume that you know how to use these tools. Basically, we're trying to go and tackle one thing and learn how to use that one thing in these bites. So the one thing that we're going to be tackling today is we're going to be tackling the checkbox. Now, the checkbox options are being populated by something called enums. And so instead of having a table reference, like we often do with collections in Webflow, they are just options. So if we have something that just has a name, we don't have to create a whole collection for it if it doesn't make sense. It's often easier just to use an enum. And so that's what the terminology that Xano uses. And so to use one, we just basically set this other value, which is a list of possible values. That's what an enum is. We set this to a list. We add a name. Description's optional, and then we input our values. Whatever the values that we want to have for those enums, we set those values. Now keep in mind, we have to know what these values are because we are going to reuse them. So I'm just going to close that off. So for this tutorial, we're doing option 1, option 2, option 3, keeping it really, really simple for us. So the first thing we want to do is in Xano is we're going to go check out the API because we want to see what our response is going to be. So in Xano Bytes, we want to query all the records. And so we've done this and we're querying all the records. And in the output, there's a few other things here, but what we're concerned about is this checkbox options enum right here. This is the value that we are going to set for it. And so that's the response that we want to have. Now we can hop into Wiz. So the first thing we're going to do is, because we have whatever values in the backend, is we're going to set those values. And so the easiest way to set those values is we're just going to set the values for the checkboxes. And the value for the checkboxes is true or false. And so it's really, really simple in Wiz to set that up. So we're going to just name it. I have it in a folder here, but we're using those attributes that we made, the Wized attributes. And so we've got our Enum option 1. And then we're setting, in the settings, we're setting the input value. And then what we're doing is we are checking this in our results. So our results for query all table, we're just going to get our results back. And what we're doing is we're checking the current options that are checked. So this is from our backend. This is our querying our table. And what we're going to do is we can see that there's an array of options in here. But what we're checking is we want to check for option 1. So we use includes and then option 1. Keep in mind, so it's saying it's true. Keep in mind, we want to make sure that this value, this string here, is exactly what we have in our enum value, because that is where it is. That is where it's coming from. So we need to make sure that it's completely, whatever we make that enum list, we have to make sure that these are the same values that we're using here. So a really handy thing is after you've done one and you have a bunch of these checkboxes to do, you can just duplicate it. So it's super handy. You go in and then you just change. For the most part, you're going to be changing the attribute, doing a different attribute. And then here we would do option 2. So, but I already have it done. So it's kind of handy because, I mean, all of this work, all this duplication actually helps, really ingrain this stuff in your brain. At least it does for me. So once we've done that, we've set option 1, set option 2, set option 3. Now, all of a sudden, right now in our backend, this is our live backend, we have option 1 and 3. So when we're in Wized, we should have option 1 and 3, and we do. So that's perfect. We're already getting the data from our backend. So now what we want to do is we want to make sure that we can submit the data, so that when a user checks the checkbox and then pushes a button, it changes the data for them. So we'll head back to Xano, and we're going to make another API request. This time, you usually get a whole bunch of default things. And so one of them would be this one here, this edit these records. And so it has all of any kind of anything that you want in your response is here. But what I often do is, because in this particular case, we're not using that, I will clone the record and I will rename it something else, because I'm not going to use this whole response. I don't want to use this whole response. For this particular one, I only want those checkbox options. So I create a different one and I just set it up with the inputs and response that I need for that particular API call. And so for this one here, we have our integer, which is our ID. That is the ID of the particular row in the table that we're querying. And then we have our checkbox options. So that's our name, checkbox options. We make it a list. This is basically if we want to add an input, we're adding an input, type enum. We want to change it to list. Checkbox options is the name. And then we're going to set the values. So then the values are whatever our values are. So it's option 1, option 2, and option 3. And yes, keep in mind the case of it matters. Everything matters for it to line up properly, or you will get errors in your response. But I don't need this because we already have one. So we will just cancel that. And so that sets our input. And so that's what's coming from our input from Wized. What we're doing is we're basically taking an array from Wiz, and we want that to be these checkbox options. So in here, we have one little quick thing to show you, and that is, so when we're setting up our inputs, we want to match our inputs. So this matches it to our backend. So this is checkbox options. Our input is checkbox options. Now what we want to do here is this is actually a filter. The reason we're using this filter is so that we don't get any blank values. So if I just remove this, I just want to remove that, and I just want to show you how to put it in. So we're just choosing a filter, we'll remove, and then we just want to remove it if it's a null value. That's it. And so if there's a null value, so if one of the checkboxes isn't full, it's not going to leave a space for that checkbox. Now, it doesn't matter in lots of cases, like for this particular one, it doesn't matter because we're not going checkbox by checkbox by checkbox to check some of this. But sometimes if you have an array and you're trying to match values, it's just a good idea to kind of have this as a rule of thumb. And now that we're set here, we can head back to Wized. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to send checkbox options to Xano. So we're going to create a data out request. We've already got one here. And we're going to send checkbox options to Xano. And so we want to send it to Xano. We have this URL endpoint that we want to use. And where that comes from is right up here in Xano. If we just cut and paste that, and we go into Wized, and what we're doing is, and what it's telling us is that we want to put this particular information, we're going to edit it, and we want it to go into this ID. So we're replacing this Wiz Xano bytes ID with the actual ID. And delete that. And we're using the put method to edit it. And then we're going to use the input. Now the input has to match our Xano input. So in our Xano input, it's called checkbox underscore options. We need to match that exactly. The keys have to match. If they don't match, you will also run into problems. So it's called checkbox options. And the value that we're going to put in here is we have actually 3 that we're going to put in. And so we want the values from our checkboxes. So for whatever our live checkbox values are, that is what we want to send. And so we have this input field, enum option 1 checkbox. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, if it's true, then we're going to give it the value of option 1. Or with the colon here, we're going to give it an empty string. So then it would end up being null. And then we're going to basically duplicate this. A lot of duplication here. You start doing things once, you can copy and paste to your heart's content. We're going to go option 2 now. And the same thing for option 3. And we also have to change the enum options. So 1, 2, and 3. So it's already telling us in this string here that we only have option 1 and option 3. And we're going to put, so the thing I found is like, this keeps it a string, and that's only because there's this last comma colon there. And so if we take that out, of course, it's going to make a liar of me. Oh, of course. We need to leave in a string as well. And then it automatically makes it an array. So it was something to be aware of. If you're looking to make a set of strings an array, make sure that they're all strings inside, and then just wrap them in array brackets, and it actually makes them an array. And that is what the response that Xano is expecting. So we need to send that to Xano, except for we're going to just do this so we can show that it's actually sending. So we've set up that. Now the one last thing we have to do is we have to trigger this request. So we've got this request is going to get sent, but when is it going to get sent? It's going to get sent when we hit a button. And so we have to set an action for that. So if we set the action, we're going to trigger this, and we're going to trigger it with this attribute, which is submit enum. And it's on click. We're going to perform a request. And that request that we just created, we're going to send that to Xano. And so when we submit this, let's just cross our fingers here. We've here's the request here. We have submitted this, and we've submitted option 2. So now if we wanted to change that, we can change that. And now it's submitted option 1 and option 3. And we can do a quick check. I guess it was already set there, but we can do a quick check, and these values are live from our database. Hope this was helpful. See you next time for some more Webflow, Wized, and Xano bites.